my group and also another surgical group that participate in trauma were there, and lots of doctors there. So each doctor got a patient. We assessed the patients and found out the severity of the illness and the injuries. Did they need to go to the intensive care? Did they need to go to the operating room immediately? Fortunately, they were all stable enough that we could get all the x-rays we needed. No one had to be rushed to the operating room, and we were able to fully assess them.
Of those that died, how substantial were their injuries? How many gunshots?
There were the one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Even the ones that died.
Pathology at the grave, so we can't say how many wounds they had or anything like that.
Or can you describe generally how substantial
There were-
the wounds were, or how substantial the injuries were?
Devastating.
Devastating because they died. So one was multiple. The people who died, they suffered multiple injuries, multiple parts. Is that okay to say that? Okay, yeah. I'm totally stop there. Yeah.
Can you talk about the preparation? I know hospitals in the area, they do this a lot where they practice for situations just like this. Does that help?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm not military background, but there's a military phrase that says failing to plan is planning to fail. So there's monthly meetings to handle emergency disaster situations, to prepare for this at multiple levels. I mean, coordinate with the local and regional trauma services and the state trauma services. So we have plans to activate people as much as possible. We had 4 operating rooms ready to go at 5 o'clock on Friday night, that's pretty remarkable. Staff stayed around. Blood bank is notified. X-ray teams are notified. Administration played a key role in making sure everything was all done right. It was done very well, and that all takes planning, all takes practice. You have to know the right people to contact, how to contact them, and so on.
No drill can ever prepare you, though, for that real-life situation. I mean,
You deal with difficult situations on a regular basis, but this recent incident, how did it affect you as a physician responding to so many patients at once?
Well, you have to sort of be sort of separate from it in the sense that you can't get too emotionally, personally involved. You have to deal with it as a sort of professional kind of thing. We've had another serious incident a few years ago. You probably remember the 5 children down in Pungo, I think it was. That was a lot more emotional because the children involved. So we are going to meet after this, probably next week sometime, and sort of debrief everything, go over it again. What can we learn from what we did? Is there improvements to be made? Those kind of things.
Dr. Thomas, you talked about it being, you just asked about being an ED when you prepare for seeing the worst of the worst.
right. I mean, this is what we train for. This is what we train for. I mean, this is why we chose to go into these professions. But when it's actually happening in the scale that it's happening, it becomes surreal. And you have to just focus, compartmentalize, attend to what's going on at that moment. That's why I do what I do.
Dr. Thomas, can you describe the scene in the yard? I mean, you said you were prepared, but I mean, what was the scene like? Was it, ready or
Controlled chaos, staff everywhere, a number of folks in different roles attending to their roles, and a few people in the middle kind of directing traffic. You go here, I need this, I need that. We mobilized resources from different areas of the hospital. We gathered equipment from other areas of the hospital to make sure we had several rooms set up in a row in order to receive the patients that we received. And it worked well. One of the things that happened in advance of our receipt of patients was EMS contacted us and asked our capabilities. There were 2 trauma centers in the area, and they wanted, when we had some sense of how many victims were arriving, how many could we handle, how many did we want to direct to the other facility. So we were well prepared for what arrived.
Just can I be real clear on the 3 that you still have in your care? 2 had significant injuries, 1 had less significant injuries, and 1 person is in, so you used the word devastated, Dr. Grady.
Yeah. They're all serious injuries in the sense that, I mean, they're gunshot wounds, which are never minor. Okay. So, as I said, 2 have been taken to the operating room to get injuries repaired. 1 is probably more fortunate, and hopefully that patient will have a full recovery. That's not clear as of this very second, but did not require urgent or operations to repair injuries. He's got, in a sense, very, very lucky with all this, but he got lucky, and the injury was, I mean, without sort of exaggerating, a little bit further over, he probably wouldn't be here today.
For clarification on the 2 that unfortunately passed, 1 died immediately. Did they receive any care, or did they pass before any care was able to be rendered to them?
I have to check with the chief here. Okay.
I wouldn't know there.
All right.
I'm curious if any of the patients that arrived here were able to speak to you, share anything about the experience or anything that you could share with us.
No, it really is not a time for us to ask that. We want to know their medical history, what's wrong with them. Some of these patients, 2 of the patients really had significant potential injuries that could, if aren't treated right away, could lose the patient very seriously, particularly the airway. The airway is critical. So we do things to protect the airway, put a breathing tube down so that if there's swelling of the neck, they don't choke off and stuff like that. So there really wasn't any chance to sort of ask those particular type of questions. I mean, for us, it's not really the place to do that. They were, significantly at risk for losing airway, which is, I mean, that would be a fatal thing.
I would also, I'm sorry, I would also say that probably would distract from our ability to focus on the issue at hand. I think that, in the initial receipt of the patient, that's not a good time for us to be asking questions about the situation.
Where were the gunshot wounds?
Can't talk about that.
Are any of the patients in a state to be released anytime soon?
No, we're not going to talk about that. That's prognosis, so we can't get into that.
The HIPAA laws are very, very tight. And we just can't say those kind of things. It's federal law mandates that.
Dr. Thomas, if you could you describe the first 30 minutes from when you're receiving the patients?
The first 30 minutes. So the first awareness we had that there was an incident occurring came from the police that were in the emergency department. We have an on-duty policeman, and so kind of a heads up that there was an active shooter. And so the first 30 minutes was almost all preparation. It took a while to stabilize the scene, to get the patients transported. And so we had at least 30 minutes of lead time before we received that first patient. Once we started receiving patients, it was a sort of a divide and conquer scenario, that we had physicians in each trauma room, we had staff in each trauma room, and we focused on our particular patient and making sure that they had the resources they needed and were stabilized. And the trauma physicians sort of were aware of every patient and, making decisions about who needed to go where next, who needed to go to the OR, who needed to go to the ICU, and how to transition them through the emergency department.
Let me just ask you to expound on something. Those who aren't local probably don't know that Virginia Beach maintains one of the largest volunteer emergency medical systems in the country. And expound a little bit on the relationship with local EMS and how that plays out in a scenario like this when they're prepping patients to bring to you, that level of communication, that kind of thing.
So EMS...
Give them their props.
EMS had established a local on-site command system, and they were in contact with the emergency department and our charge nurse and the physicians in the emergency department as we had updates on number of victims that were to be transported. They were in constant communication with the emergency department. And as I mentioned before, how many patients are you prepared to take? Identifying the capabilities of the hospitals in the area and who can receive what. We were able to, through that EMS response system, divert non-trauma ambulances from our facility to other non-trauma facilities for the time period that we were receiving the trauma victims, so that we could focus our resources entirely on the trauma situation. The police put our emergency department on lockdown to protect us from a security perspective, and so no one could go in or out without appropriate identification and, you know, a need to be there. So that made us safe to be able to do our job. It really was the best that I could have possibly imagined in a horrible situation.
Just for clarification, all the people that came to the hospital, they were all transported by ambulance? No one came in on their own at all?
All the gunshot wound victims came by ambulance, that's correct.
And they are all still in the ICU?
Two were deceased, 3 are still admitted here, 1 is admitted to another hospital.
They're in the intensive care.
Can we
Yeah.
call that a
Pardon?
finish?
Is there anything we're missing that you guys want to convey that we just failed to ask?
No, I think, again, I think, emphasize what I said earlier. I mean, the hospital really responded well. At all levels, you had volunteer surgeons, doctors coming in to say, what can I do to help? Nursing staff stayed late. OR teams were called back in. I mean, it went very, very well. A lot of volunteer effort by the nursing staff and medical staff to come and take care of the patients. And it just went extremely smoothly.
Dr. Roberts, we talked about this earlier, but let me get your response. This happens way too often.
Yes, it does.
In churches, synagogues, high schools, grade schools, you name it.
Right.
Now a government office here. You're on the working end of these things. I assume you have confidence in you. What
Correct.
is your feeling, your thought? And you trained for this, you never expected to have to deal with it. What is your feeling as someone who deals with this on this end?
Well, I mean, you know, it's, you say you never expect it to happen here, and of course it does. These are never good things, and you sort of wonder what's happening to society that's now, it's like weekly almost, you know, and why is this happening? And I don't have an answer for that. It's disheartening to see it. I mean, there was just how many shootings last week, you know, and there was a shooting in Chesapeake recently. I mean,
It's senseless, it's
Yeah, it's-
tragic.
yeah.
It's, and as much as Virginia Beach is a city, it's got a small town heart. This is taking a toll on our community. This is our friends or neighbors. And from the hospital's perspective, you know, we'll have a beginning and an end to our responsibility, but this is something that will continue to affect the families, the victims, the community for a very long time.
Do you guys talk to the families after you care for the victims? Like you guys personally did?
I personally didn't, since I was more sort of the triage aspect of it, but the other doctors certainly have done that, of course. Yeah.
I have not.
Yeah. And the physicians are actually involved in the, you know, hands-on, absolutely spoke to the families and try to give them some perspective.
You guys, like, treat the victims and then, you know, talk to the families afterwards.
Well, we try, yeah, multiple times. It'd be nice, ideally, you know, to speak to them as soon as we can afterwards and get some sense of how the patient is and any medical problems, and then talk to them as well and tell them how the loved ones are doing. And surgeons will talk to families after surgery, of course, let them know what's going on, try and give them some sense of where the prognosis is.
And one of the things in the beginning phases of this situation is it's a very controlled environment. Families weren't free to come and go to the hospital in the early phases. They had a place for families to go to get information. The police were the ones controlling that sharing of information. So early on, there wasn't that opportunity.
Okay. I think that's about it.
Dr. O'Grady talked about how you haven't seen something quite like this in your career. How long have you guys been doing your jobs?
20 years for me.
Like 35 plus.
What's that?
35 plus.
How much of that time was spent here?
30 years in the fall.
And I've been here 20 years.
Okay, why don't we finish? Thank you all
Thank you.
very much.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you doing this. Sorry.
This one yours? Oh, no, it's not.